Hello, my loves, and welcome back to a little bit of Fluffenhammer adjacent. Now, those of you who have been keeping tabs on what's happening over at Games Workshop and in the worlds of Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 will know there's a lot on the horizon at the moment. There's a lot going on in all of the various universes and game systems, but perhaps one of the most exciting, certainly for me from a personal perspective, is the reintroduction of what are now known as the Asuryani, the craft world Eldar, as they used to be once upon a time. In fact, the Eldar as they once were, way back in the depths of prehistory. Those of you who know me will realise that I'm more of a chaos boy these days. I like the various forces of chaos. I like a little bit of gribbly, Lovecraftian darkness in my armies, I really do. But my introduction to the hobby was actually through the Asuryani, or the Eldar as they were known back in the depths, the early days of Second Ed. That's when I came into the hobby, when I was about, I think it was about 8 years old, when I was introduced into the Warhammer 40,000 universe. And the original Codex Eldar, which was one of the very earliest second edition codices, was the first book I ever bought from Games Workshop regarding the Warhammer 40,000 universe. So most of what I knew at that time came from that book. It was my grounding, as it were, and it still is one of the better books. It's so beautifully written. The artwork is amazing, and it's the book that really crystallized what the Eldar are. There was a time back in the days of Rogue Trader when they were just space elves. That's all they were. It was back when Games Workshop were just drawing on every influence they could, when they were just basically throwing stuff at the wall to see what would stick. The space elves, or the Eldar as they later became known, were just one of the many armies that actually took off. They actually gained some traction in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and those early incarnations, the space elves and the Eldar as they became, are really interesting because you can see in them the beginnings, sort of like the primordial beginnings of what would eventually elaborate and evolve into the various different factions of the Eldar. So at that time, way back when, there wasn't really much about the craft worlds or about the various parts of the Eldar. They were basically just pirates. They were reavers out in space. They were just the remains of this ancient civilization that had once dominated the universe, but now there was little left of them. It wasn't until the Second Ed Codex when they became known as the Eldar officially, and when the notion of the craft worlds, the Elder Path, came about. But what's really interesting about that book is how they take incredible pains to remove them from their origin. So they didn't want them to just be Tolkien-esque elves in a science fiction universe anymore. They wanted them to be disturbingly alien in their natures, despite their humanoid appearance, despite the fact that they superficially resemble human beings in a kind of distorted fashion, or in an exaggerated fashion. They wanted them to be for that tension to be actually part of what they are. So they appear superficially humanoid, but that's where the similarities end. The Eldar, or the Eldari as they are now, are not human, and in fact they are very far removed from human. There are certain elements of their biology, but also just of their makeup, of what they are, that makes them very far removed from human beings. For example, they have a sensory suite, a sort of sensory system that means that they can experience things in ways that human beings can't even imagine. The depths and the heights of their sensory experience of the universe is beyond human imagination. Not even the Space Marines can experience things in the way that the Eldari can. And that is also true of their emotional lives. They tend to go for absolute extremes in their emotional lives, and they dedicate themselves to particular crafts and arts and ways of life to a degree and in a way that no human being could ever understand. It's so extreme, it's so powerful that it actually consumes them. They develop different facets of their personalities, and in fact entirely new personalities around those particular arts and crafts. So when you meet an Eldari, when you talk to them, it depends on what mode they're in as to what personality you're going to get. The coalescence of the background around the craft worlds, and the fact that the Eldari don't manufacture their weapons and their technology, they grow them from this psycho-reactive material called Wraithbone. All of that coalesced in the Second Ed Codex, and it was incredible. Absolutely incredible. I've always had a massive soft spot for the Eldari as a result of the background in that book. They're also the race that knows the most about chaos and about the nature of the warp and the webway and the threat that those things pose. They understand in a way that humanity does not. Well, they've seen it because, of course, almost their entire race, almost their entire species was wiped out in one cataclysmic event, which was the birth of Slaanesh, which they're responsible for. At the height of their empire, they were arguably one of the most successful races in 40k once upon a time. Their civilization was once utopian. They spread further and did more than humanity did at its apex, which is arguably at the height of the Great Crusade, when you do actually have something like a human empire spreading throughout the cosmos. The Eldari actually did do it. They managed to conquer the entire universe, and their technology and their psychic abilities was such that they didn't have to do anything. Their entire lives were bliss, dedicated to arts and crafts and the pursuit of pleasure. It was entirely utopian, which of course ultimately gave birth to Slaanesh. Not only that, it also gave birth to the Drukhari. And the Drukhari are really interesting too, because I love the Drukhari. They are one of my favourite races in 40k. But at one time there was not this separation. There was not this delineation between the Asuryani and the Drukhari, or rather the Craft World Elder and the Dark Eldar. That didn't exist. Rather, what you had were different offshoots of the Eldari race. So you had the Eldar and the Craft World. You had the Exodites, who were kind of like the more tribal, feral Eldari that had settled on other worlds and had regressed from their technological status. And also they rode dinosaurs, which is kind of cool in and of itself. But you also had the notion of Eldari pirates. They were called Elder Pirates in the Second Ed book, and they were the Reavers that would arguably later on evolve into the Dark Eldar. Back in the days of Rogue Trader, you also had Chaos Eldar as well. You had Eldar that were possessed by demons or that had dedicated themselves to chaos, and they were bad news. Back then, your Eldari Chaos Champions were probably some of the most powerful servants of chaos in existence, because the degree and the depth to which they dedicated themselves to chaos was so extreme. It wasn't until 3rd Ed that you got this delineation between the Craft World Eldar, the Asuryani as they would later become, and the Dark Eldar. The introduction of the Dark Eldar kind of splintered and fractured the race, which is kind of fun. It shows you different extremes of this species, and I love them both. I really do. I particularly love the Drukhari after their reinvention in, was it 5th or 4th Ed? I think it was the latter days of 4th Ed when Phil Kelly completely reinvented them. Absolutely beautiful army, but I still have an incredible soft spot for the Asuryani, and for not just for them on the tabletop, and they're great on the tabletop. They're real fun. They're very brightly coloured, loads of primary colours. They're very fast. They tend to hit quite hard on the tabletop, but also be very, 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 very fragile. So you've got to know how each of your units work in synchronicity with one another. But it's the background more than anything that does it for me. I've always loved the different craft worlds and the different sub-factions of Eldari, which of course is more expansive now than it's ever been. You have the Inari now, which is another splinter faction of the race, and a rather extreme one as well. Certainly the one that has changed the species the most, because they have introduced an entirely new ideology, if you like, into the Eldari race. Not only that, but they've upset the status quo of the different craft worlds, the divisions between them and the Drukhari of Comora. Perhaps arguably one of the biggest changes with the introduction of the Inari is the shaking up of the politics of the craft world of Ulthwé. The craft world of Ulthwé is basically, you know how each of the armies has their own prime faction, the one that defines the faction beyond any other. So you've got the Ultramarines for the Space Marines, you've got the Black Legion for the Chaos Space Marines, you've got the Goths for the Orcs, you've got the Cabal of the Blackheart for the Drukhari. Ulthwé is that for the Asuryani. Ulthwé epitomizes what the Eldari are about. It is the prime craft world. It is the big mover and shaker. And it used to be headed by a guy named Eldar Altran, who was one of the oldest Eldari in existence, and certainly one of the most powerful psychers in the universe, barring the likes of Magnus and Ahriman, perhaps, arguably. He's kind of on an equal footing with Ahriman, I would say. But the introduction of the Inari has changed that completely. It's actually removed Eldar Altran from his seat of power, because he actually is one of the facilitators of the Inari cult, I suppose you could call it, or creed, and the other the rest of the Farseers of Ulthwé are not pleased with him. So now he is basically a nomad. He's been exiled from Ulthwé and is out in the universe somewhere leading the Inari around, which is absolutely brilliant. I mean, that's a huge shake-up. Imagine if somewhere in the background something happened that meant that Marneus Calgar was exiled and excommunicated from his position as the Lord of the Ultramarines, or if Abaddon the Despoiler was toppled from his seat of power. That's how significant that is. Eldar Altran was, for the longest time, the very epitome of the Eldari race. He was the prime character, but now his status has shifted massively. We've had things like the destruction of Biel-Tan. Again, Biel-Tan is one of the bigger craft worlds. There was a later edition where Biel-Tan kind of became the default paint scheme, and also kind of like the default craft world for the Eldari, largely because it has lots of aspect warriors in it, and they wanted to sell some of the shiny new aspect warrior kits. But that now has become fractured, like literally almost destroyed by the Inari and by the manipulations of Eldar Altran. So there is a lot of internal politics in the race now, which I absolutely love. The very notion of the craft worlds is wonderful. The craft worlds are these gigantic, and when I say gigantic, I mean like impossible to conceive in terms of their scale. They're technically starships, but they are as big as small planets, and they are self-contained biodomes, effectively. They are environments that function in and of themselves and insulate the Eldari from the manipulations of chaos, the influence of the warp, but also from the dangers of the rest of the universe. And they move, they're mobile. They're not just worlds, they're also crafts. You know, they can be piloted. They can actually be piloted through space, and some of them can be piloted through the warp as well. It's really incredible. The notion of the craft world is absolutely beautiful. The fact that also that they're not built, they're grown. They're not manufactured, they're grown from the psychoconductive material called wraithbone. It's absolutely beautiful. There is an image of what a craft world looks like that has been in most of the Eldari codices since, I think, around 4th ed, and it is absolutely beautiful. They are like very long, they're a bit like continents. They're like gigantic continents that have been uprooted, and they have all of these different flutes and domes and spires and offshoots. Beauty is one of the key things for the Eldari race. Almost everything in the Warhammer 40k universe is like, it's like industrial punk, it's grim dark, it's cyberpunk, flourished with a little bit of HR Giga biomechanisms and that kind of thing. The Eldari are completely different. They introduce an entirely other aesthetic where everything is perfect, everything is pristine, and it's so beautiful. It's a great contrast for the other aesthetics that you find out there in the 40k universe, and that's another reason I love them. They're so, most things in the 40k universe, like your Space Marines, your Chaos Space Marines, they're Baroque, aren't they? They're Gothic, they're big, they're clunky, they're rather hefty. The Eldari are lithe and graceful and elegant. And it's just a wonderfully different aesthetic. And we've seen, they've been arguably the Eldari, certainly the Asuryani, not the Drukhari, they're doing really bloody well. The latest Drukhari Codex for 9th Ed is an absolute killer. It's insanely good. As anyone who goes and looks at like the tournament or competitive play league tables will tell you, the Drukhari are doing very, very, very well indeed. But the Asuryani have been kind of on the back foot for quite a while now. After dominating certain eras of like 6th and 7th Ed, they're kind of on the back foot at the moment. They're certainly one of the lesser armies, and in one of the big elements of their neglect is in terms of the miniatures range. I shit you not, up until recently, there are miniatures still in use in the range that were new when I first started the hobby at 8 years old. I kid you not. The Warp Spiders, Aspect Warriors, the Phoenix Lords for the most part, barring one or two notable exceptions, the Avatar of Keelah Mensch Arcane, all from that era. They are all from the era when I first started the game. However, the Asuryani are coming back very soon for 9th Ed, and it's very, very clear that what they've tried to do is reinvigorate the entire miniatures range. So not only have we got new Craft World Guardians, which are like the basic troops of the Craft Worlds, we've also got new Aspect Warriors, new Dark Reaper Aspect Warriors, a new Phoenix Lord in the form of Morgan Ra, who was always one of my favourites. But perhaps the most exciting, arguably the most exciting, there's a new Avatar model. At long last, there's a new the Avatar. For those who don't know, the Avatar is basically it's a walking splinter of the Eldari's god of war. There's this whole mythology about the Eldari mythology with regards to their gods and their oral cycles is derived from all manner of different real-world human mythologies. The most notable of them is Greek mythology. There's a lot of parallels between the Eldari pantheon and the stories that are part of it and the oral traditions of ancient Greece, to the point where some of the gods are basically interchangeable. So you've got a god called Vol, who's the smith god. He's Hephaestus. He is down the line Hephaestus. But there's also other elements as well. So there's like mother goddesses like Aisha, for example, who's kind of... Aisha is a mixture of things. There's an element of Gaia in her. There's an element of Tiamat in her. Old mother goddesses, effectively. That's what she is. She is the goddess of fertility and of... she is the originator in mythology of the Eldari race. One of these gods is the war god, who is Ares and Mars. He is Keelah Mensch Arcane, the bloody-handed god. He's Ares. He is effectively Ares. He is one of the only Eldar. Of course, in Warhammer 40,000, gods exist. They actually do have existence in the warp, right? So the Eldari gods did actually exist at one time, but when Slaanesh was born, Slaanesh consumed them and destroyed all but three. And they are Kegarach, the laughing god of the Harlequins, Inied, the god of the dead, and Keelah Mensch Arcane, the god of war and murder and bloodshed. Keelah Mensch Arcane did fight with Slaanesh, apparently, and was shattered into lots of different splinters, and each one of those splinters came to rest in a craft world, and those splinters can be, through an elaborate ritual, like a blood sacrifice ritual, that's detailed in each of the codices, that splinter can be resurrected. So the avatars of the bloody-handed god fight alongside the Eldari. It's effectively a greater demon. It is in every respect a greater demon of Keelar Mensch Arcane, to the point whereby it has all the rules and vulnerabilities that demons have. But although its rules have always been generally pretty good, the miniature has been lacking basically since, well, 3rd ed, really. It's an old Mike McVeigh sculpt that originally was cast in lead way back when. I used to have it. I painted up an avatar when I was a kid, and it was one of the first miniatures I did a decent job on. I really liked it. But we are getting a new one, and I'm imagining the new one is going to be a big dude. I'm imagining what they're going to do with the avatar, which is what it deserves. They're going to make it into a Lord of War option, which means it's going to be really, really, really big. It's going to be the equivalent of a greater demon. It's got to be. To make it what it's supposed to be, it's going to have to be that. It's going to be the Eldari's equivalent of the Lord of War, which means it's probably going to get a bit of a shot in the arm in terms of rules as well, which is really cool. I am very, very, very excited for what's coming down the line, I've got to say. And it's going to be lovely to see the Asuryani back. They are a different note in Warhammer 40,000. They are a nice diversion from a lot of the... Although they have their own grim darkness, aesthetically they're very bright, they're very colourful, they're very dynamic, and it's a nice difference. They present a different opportunity for people and players who want something a little bit different from the setting, and I cannot wait. It looks like they're pushing them hard, just like they have done with the Necrons, the Gene Stealer cults, with practically every army they've reintroduced into 9th ed. It looks like they're pushing hard to make this a viable miniatures range, and I personally cannot wait.